Prime Minister Modi put a cash ban and a goods and services tax in place last year to stimulate India's economic growth. How well are the reforms working?
एक ऐसा कैटालिस्ट है जो देश के व्यापार को उसमें जो असंतुलन है.
Trade tensions between China and the US have shown no sign of easing. Can the Chinese economy keep up its healthy pace under the pressure?
中国人民将继续与世界同行，为人类做出更大贡献。
Washington has proposed the Indo-Pacific concept allegedly to counterbalance China's influence in the Asia-Pacific region. But where does New Delhi stand on this strategy? And can the dragon and the elephant achieve economic co-prosperity in the years to come?
Being the representatives of emerging economies as well as BRICS members, China and India have never slowed their steps to rejuvenation. Prime Minister Modi has launched a cash ban and goods and services tax to generate impulse in India's economic growth. Meanwhile, China is fighting a trade war with the United States on the one hand and dealing with its own domestic financial risks on the other. So how will these two Asian giants make their own path to economic prosperity? And what stands in their path? To take a closer look at the reforms being carried out by these two nations, I'm very happy to be joined in the studio by Professor M.D. Nalapad from Manipur University, India, and Charles Liu, who is the founder of How Capital. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. First question goes to Professor Nalapad. Last year, India launched a very impressive tax reform, GST, new goods and services tax, in 70 years since you became independent, which will turn the country of 1.3 billion into one big market for goods and services for the first time. So what differences will this move bring to people and the nation of India?
Well, I'd like to say that it's a very welcome move, and as you correctly said, we have had a lot of barriers to within the Indian market which ought not to have been there, and GST will remove those barriers. Unfortunately, there were certain aspects of GST, for example, multiple rates and unnecessarily high rates that have kind of reduced the immediate significance of GST. But the good news is that Prime Minister Modi is a very pragmatic individual, and he has given instructions to the officials concerned to make changes. So already several rates have been brought down and GST has been simplified. So this process is expected to go on. So my estimation is within about a year or so, you will have a good GST in place, which is of very high quality. Today we have GST, but it needs some modifications, and the Prime Minister, in my view, is going to ensure these modifications carried out.
Charles, from your perspective, what does the painful process of GST actually mean for the upcoming elections for the BJP?
That's not a subject of my expertise. No, but GST, as Professor said, is critical. It's an instrument to bring the fragmented market of India into one market. Now, of course, there are growing pains, and anything implemented that is so vast and so broad is bound to impact on some vested interest groups, and that may impact on the election. But for India in the long term, it's critical that this is done.
Isn't this a popular topic for people and observers on both sides to draw a comparison between India and China? After all, we are, as I said in the opening remarks, representatives of the emerging markets. Therefore, the path of our development and reforms in particular will capture headlines around the world. Now, it seems it's very difficult for Indians, which is a democracy, of course, is the most populous democracy, to achieve consensus between different political forces of the parliament. Therefore, it's very difficult for Prime Minister Modi to steer clear of obstacles that get in the way of his reform. And people compare him to the architect of China's modernization campaign, Mr. Deng Xiaoping.
Well, no, I'd like to point out that when China began its modernization around 1978, I think the Indian economy was roughly the same size as the Chinese economy. Today, China is 5 times larger. So frankly, a lot of our policies need to be changed. Now, it's not the fact that we are a democracy. In fact, It's one of our strong strengths that we are a democracy. It makes us a much more stable nation. But the fact that so many, as he very correctly said, vested interests are involved. And vested interests are involved in creating obstacles to modern reform. And as a consequence, what happens is they bribe people, they bully people, politicians and officials, and they slow down reform. So we have seen this problem of vested interests and corruption slowing down reform. I think in China now you're taking very significant steps to avoid corruption and to bring down corruption. Mahathir Mohamad is doing the same thing in Malaysia. So I think India also needs a thoroughgoing anti-corruption drive, because the obstacle to reform is not democracy, it's corruption.
Well, you put your finger on the interesting issue of strongman politics. Dr. Mahathir is no exception. He was the Prime Minister for 20 years, and at the age of 93, he won the campaign again, surprisingly. Therefore, what do you think of the impact of strongman politics in pushing reforms domestically? Deng Xiaoping was, of course, a strongman, and you see Donald Trump, perhaps, also as a kind of a strongman, but not very much so from the American perspective. So what do you think of the strength of reform that is badly needed in deepening the reforms in this year in particular, which witnesses the 40th anniversary of our opening up and reform?
There's no question. There are two aspects, two critical components that make reform work. One is longer-term strategic view. Every 2 years election, every 4 years election makes it very, very difficult for a strategic vision to be formed to implement reform. Number two, you have to be able to push aside all the obstacles that the vested interest groups put in your way. So you need very, very strong and powerful, whether or not a strong man or a strong group or a strong core is irrelevant. Because if you talk about the major reforms that you've seen in Asia in history, for example, Li Guangyao was seen as a very, very strong man, and he brought fabulous returns to his people in Singapore.
A major task of the strongman politics is to break up the monopoly of interest groups. So what do you think of this role, if not a major mission of a strongman politically?
You know, I think what is needed is a strong vision of the future, a strong belief in the people, and frankly a high level of integrity. So that is really what is needed. If you have, for example, in several countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, you had very strong men, and the regimes did very, very badly because they were strong only for themselves, their families and their friends. So the question is, whom are you strong for? Are you strong only for the few, or are you strong for the many, for all the people? Now in China, I'm quite fascinated by the very strong anti-corruption campaign that President Xi Jinping is launching. And I would like to see a similar strength in the campaign which Prime Minister Modi is frankly launching. I think in India, far too few tigers have been caught. A lot of flies, but almost no tigers.
Well, let's come back to examine the economic performance of India in the first place. The IMF forecasts that the GST will eventually lift India's GDP growth back above 8% after that slipped to 6.1 last quarter due to the cash ban last year. How do you view, Charles, how do you view the prospects of India's economic growth in the next decade?
I'm actually very optimistic, because what I see happening is India is gradually integrating into the whole Asian sphere of economic growth.
As part of the Indo-Pacific strategy?
No.
But that
totally has nothing
that's
to
the
do.
mark of a geopolitical rivalry, right?
Well, let them talk about that, because what we have in Asia today is the most modern, most efficient, most low-cost, and the most productive supply chain in the world, more than Europe, more than the United States. India is gradually, slowly but surely, integrating into this supply chain, which is has brought tremendous
Charles, let me
benefits.
follow up your interesting point of the global chain with this follow-up point of China's investment in the infrastructure of India to help facilitate your process of becoming yet another major labor-intensive manufacturing center of the world.
Well, I think the scope is immense for a simple reason that today the prosperity has come to China. It's now become it is a middle-income country almost, and as a consequence, a lot of production units in China may find it better to relocate to Vietnam or India or countries like that. Now, if you relocate to India, the advantage is that you have a very huge market. So I think the future is very bright, and I was very enthused by the Wuhan summit between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. Because I think Wuhan has changed the entire atmospherics and the ambience of Sino-Indian relations. And today I'm extremely hopeful that we can have a very vigorous commercial relationship between India and China.
What can we benefit from a rising India, a more open India, a highly developed India? Because there have been debates about geopolitical rivalry along the border and history, so on and so forth.
Well, all those rivalries and all those, some of it originates from outside of the Asian region. We won't name the countries involved. It's not just the United States. There are other countries in the 1970s, 1980s, which were also quite heavily into containment of China. Now, what I see happening in terms of India's integration into the Asian economy is you're creating a supply chain that will benefit everybody in Asia, but it's also benefiting people in South America, in Africa, and elsewhere, or even in the United States. India itself is a mass market. 30 years ago, people came to China because of cheap labor. That's it. Today, they're in China because of the market itself. The same progression would take place in India, but critical for all of that to take place for India is infrastructure. Without building infrastructure, you can't do it. China spent 20 years building one of the most modern infrastructures in the world. Without infrastructure, you can't have a supply chain. You can't have efficient movement of components and movement of goods and services.
The side effects and side products of our rapid expansion of the infrastructure network in China is overcapacity, local debts, and do you think with that hindsight wisdom in mind, Prime Minister Modi and indeed other Indian senior politicians will help avoid the pitfall?
Well, I'd like to say that I believe that the authorities in India are looking to China and the Chinese expertise, for example, to improving the rail network in India. And we have an existing rail network, we have an existing road network, so hopefully in a shorter time than would otherwise be the case, we can ramp these up to a scale in which an efficient supply chain can be created. You know, we have world-class companies in India which are selling all across the world, and they're using the logistical systems available in India. So I think that it is possible, and the Chinese are frankly in infrastructure, they are easily the most experienced, and they have shown that. Any visitor to China will know that. So the good point, as I said, is that I think the relationship is now transforming itself. And this relationship, this transformed relationship is very important not only for Asia, but has correctly been pointed out for the other continents as well.
Thank you so much. You are watching Dialogue with Professor M.D. Nalapad and Charles Liu. We're discussing implications of a very healthy development of the bilateral relationship between India and China, the two biggest emerging markets, very dynamic economies. But we also look at the challenges lying ahead for both competitors. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back, gentlemen. We do have our own vulnerabilities economically and domestically in China. For example, President Xi Jinping hosted an emergency session to help stabilize the jitters in this real estate market, because there have long been speculations, very strong doubts as to what we call the systematic financial risks arising from, first of all, the real estate market. Look at the sizable local debts and the bubbles. So To what degree do you think China will be able to manage the crisis, quote unquote?
Well, first of all, I think the bubble in real estate is many small bubbles, not yet a systemic issue for the whole of China. And the reason is very simple. What we had in 2008 in the United States was leverage on derivatives leading to subprime and many multiple layers of products, financial products, which were created. China, most people buy, maybe there's a mortgage, but we don't have derivatives on derivatives and that type of leverage, which creates the systemic risk. But real estate has been too much, over the last decade, too much of a driving force for China's growth. So that creates issues, and China has to find new channels, a new direction to replace real estate development as the driving force for its growth.
Land revenue is said to be the driving force behind the local GDP growth rate, but it's no longer the case. In fact, it serves as a drag on the sustainable growth of our economy. Therefore, what do you think of the driving force for further development in the special year that witnesses the 40th anniversary of China's opening up?
Well, I think, in my view, the most important resource that you have is actually the Chinese people and the entrepreneurial spirit of the Chinese people. So now, thanks to this anti-corruption campaign in the state-owned enterprises, you are having more and more professional management. So a situation has come, frankly, in which they can compete with private industry run by Chinese.
But here is the counter-argument, excuse me, Charles. You know, the issue of a controversial remains the issue of SOE remains pretty controversial. From perspectives of overseas observers, they say, look, this is none other than a major obstacle that prevents China from effectively implementing other reforms. The non-public sector of the Chinese economy finds it very difficult to have a free access to loans, hence the rise of the shadow banking. Today we have this serious lack of confidence on the side of both investors and consumers, hence the alleged outbound flight of the capital one way or another, despite our enormous efforts to control the flow of capital from China to the rest of the world. So what do you think of this current confidence crisis, quote unquote, again?
There's no question that it is a very difficult matter to address. There's no question that the leadership is trying to do something about this. I can give you some examples. PBOC, People's Bank, recently just allocated in terms of 我们说放水, letting out more cash, another 500 billion RMB, but very specifically it's supposed to go to small and medium-sized companies and going to the agricultural sector for farmers who need a lot of cash just to survive. So there is an attempt to use different channels and different means, including specific benchmarks for banks. You have to lend to small and medium-sized companies. But for banks, they prefer not to. If you go by market forces, there won't be any loans to the small and medium-sized companies. We know about micro-lending in India, for example. It's very difficult. So at least there is an attempt being made, part of many different levers which are in the hands of the government, in trying to improve the lot of the private and small and medium-sized companies. Don't forget, I think one unofficial count is there are 69 million small entrepreneurs, basically employing over 67% of the Chinese labor force.
At the same time, thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises go bankrupt every day, every passing day.
That's right.
Do you view this as a healthy cycle, healthy economic cycle for some to thrive and others die?
How many go bankrupt every day? How many new businesses also spring up every day? How many new registered for example, in the new technology sector in Shenzhen and Hangzhou.
Or in the Silicon Valley of Zhongguancun,
Exactly,
Beijing.
exactly. So you have traditional business.
Now let me go back to the one interesting issue that you spoke of briefly, the issue of liquidity. Now the PBOC unleashed enormous amount of liquidity, up to 500 billion. Most of them, as you said, go to small, medium-sized enterprises in the rural sector. But what about the issue of M2, which is allegedly 260% of the GDP? I mean, that's a lot compared with 90% of the United States.
It is something which is a very serious matter, except that you have to keep the economy rolling. What is missing now is a more sophisticated fiscal policy. So far, for the last decade, from 2008 and 2011, 2014, it had been mostly monetary policy of PBOC. And I think it would be worthwhile for the central government, which is trying to do this now, to implement a more sophisticated fiscal policy. For example, taking local tax rights and consolidating with the state tax.
But what do you think of the debates, if not quarrels, between PBOC and the Ministry of, you know what I mean?
But that's exactly what I'm addressing. That's exactly
policy debates that come across as something normal, right? In our decision-making circles.
No.
This is part of Chinese democracy, by the way.
It is a highly democratic.
Not to use a ballot box.
We call it a mother and father fight. You know.
Under the same roof.
Yeah, under the same roof. But this is exactly what I meant, because so far for the last 10 years, taking monetary policy of liquidity is the easy way out. Fiscal policy is much more elaborate and more complex. So what the PBOC is telling Father Finance, Ministry of Finance, you have to start addressing this.
Now, I don't want to leave our friend Professor Nalapat marginalized. His voice is very important for us to understand properly what is going on between the two economies. Do you think the current trade war between the United States and China will benefit India, in that will open our market further to let in, for example, Indian pharmaceuticals? Have you ever heard of the popularity of a recent movie, Dying to Survive? It spent much of the time addressing the issue of drug smuggling between our two countries, and it served a very benevolent purpose.
Well, I'd like to say that I'm sorry to say that people who consider this idealist, like, for example, the prime ministers of Britain, the chancellors of Germany, the presidents of the United States, they have done everything possible to block cheap Indian pharmaceuticals from coming to Europe and coming to the United States. The United States could have benefited significantly from cheaper pharmaceuticals from India, and I'm delighted, frankly, that China has now opened the door to these cheap and good pharmaceuticals from India. So that's one of the ways in which this kind of cooperation can take place. And there are many, many ways. As he correctly said, Asian supply chains. And in this connection, I'd like to talk about this Belt and Road project, because that is a project that, frankly, is very, very important from the point of view of connectivity, because connectivity is stage one in rapid economic development.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned...
If I could just add, thank you, Professor, for referring to my concept of Asia,
yes,
because too much focus has been China and United States.
Correct.
That's not correct. It's actually a U.S. attack against the Asian supply chain. And it is the Asian supply chain which has risen up and has supplied benefits to the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
I fully agree with you that we should spend more time discussing the derivative of U.S.-China relationship, India. India is the very helpful and promising derivative in many ways. Now, I'm glad you mentioned BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. Indians are known to have been very reluctant to join BRI, but it seems there is some improvement in our mutual understanding about what it means to sustain this idea. What's the latest progress on the Indian side?
Well, I think there are a few issues to be discussed, and I think these issues can be, in my view, sorted out on both sides. So the fact of the matter is that, for example, take from Kunming to Calcutta, there's a suggestion for a road from there. There are also some very ambitious suggestions for a road right from China to Sri Lanka through India.
I wonder if you have discussed privately with the Prime Minister Mahathir about the building of Pan-Asia Railway connecting Kunming through Singapore with Kuala Lumpur. Is that part of also your vision?
That is an Indian vision, and Prime Minister Mahathir is, I'm very certain, open to any idea which improves Malaysia. I recently watched an interview of his in which he was very, very open to the idea of connectivity. So this entire idea of connectivity which the Chinese are doing, basically it's expanding the superb connectivity they have inside China to the rest of the world. So, but so far as India is concerned, there are some technical issues to be discussed, but I'm certain that these can be sorted out. And in an improving climate, I'm very certain that this connectivity will also extend to the Indian side.
But this initiative of building a Pan-Asia railway connecting Kunming with Kuala Lumpur is done probably at the cost of 3 mega projects back in Malaysia, due to the anti-graft campaign that Prime Minister Mahathir launched against his predecessor, Najib. So what do you think of the price we pay for opting for other alternatives?
Well, things have changed a lot, even in the last year, after Mr. Trump was elected. I think Mahathir is coming in as the...
He's coming in September, next month.
That's right, he's visiting China. One has to accept the changes in the geopolitical framework. What I see happening in the geopolitical framework overall is it's not a question of dollars and cents. It's a question of willingness and enthusiasm for collaboration, which after Wuhan, which we saw between China and India, and the same thing is beginning to happen between China and many other countries of Asia. It comes back to my view that the Asia integration is beginning to take place, and that will benefit everyone. And U.S. will find it very, very difficult to use Indo-Pacific strategy or whatever else to be able to contain that.
Well, I just want to add that Prime Minister Modi made it very clear in the Shangri-La dialogue that India believes in an inclusive Indo-Pacific. And by inclusive, it is clearly intended to mean that China will have to be very much a part of any architecture that is designed for the Indo-Pacific. You cannot have an Indo-Pacific without the largest country in Asia as part of it.
Perhaps Prime Minister Modi concurs with the idea that RCEP is an integral part of the Indo-Pacific strategy, with China being a major player. Thank you, everybody, for being with us, and see you next time. Goodbye.